Welcome to ReReview, where we watch movies from our past with a perspective from today. Your hosts are Matt, Bobby, and Austin, and we love the films from our youth, so we're taking a look back to see if they still hold up. On this episode, we're discussing Saved. It was released in 2004, directed by Brian Donnelly, starring Jenna Malone, Mandy Moore, and Macaulay Culkin. This movie tells the story of high school students negotiating how to live their lives with their learned ideologies. Now, this is a fair warning. We're spoiling an 18-year-old movie, so if you haven't seen it, we will be revealing key plot points. I picked this film, and it was one that I saw such a long, long time ago. And the reason I wanted us to watch it is I feel like we all live these lives with very specific experiences that can be unknown to other people. Like you have a way of living your life, a way you see the world, that you approach it, and you find groups that think like you, but you may not know how another group thinks. And I feel like this movie gives like a good insight into a very specific Christian perspective and the challenges that people face as their ideologies conflict with real life, that the things that they do as they live. And for me, this film, like, I understand it looks like a really big shot at the hypocrisy of people and religion, but I feel like it better reflects the difficulty of life and the decisions that people have to make in spite of what they actually believe. It's just something that's kind of always gotten to me. I still have conversations about this type of thing with friends today about how humans live their lives and do that type of thing. So, this movie is dressed up as a comedy, but I feel like it does so much more than that. Understanding there's probably some things we'll get into about how this movie decides to tell that tale, but that's really the perspective I think I was coming from, and watching it again still reminded me of all of that. Just the decisions that we as people make, and what we try to stand up for, and what we believe in, and the things we do in spite of those beliefs and how we approach it. But I'll ask Bobby, what did you think, your initial thought of this film?
One of the things that I really thought about was that this is kind of like to me, like an outsiders kind of movie. I mean, I don't think like a Breakfast Club or something like that is like an apples to apples comparison, but to me, but it didn't seem like it was going to be that like that in the very beginning, and then it kind of like shifted that way to me towards like the middle and the end, about like looking at a group that doesn't quite fit in with the rest of everybody, and kind of like how they deal with what they have to deal with. And it was pretty interesting how, like, okay, there's like a clear antagonist villain here, and then there's your outsider group. And I thought that it was really interesting. It's like one of those high school kind of drama cliche kind of things about that, but it was pretty layered and interesting, I thought.
Matt, what about you?
I mean, honestly, going into this, I had not seen Saved prior to this, so this doesn't have the nostalgia value that I guess it might have for you two. So I was kind of going into it fresh. I had seen the trailer when it first came out, and to be honest, I had a very specific impression of what I thought the movie was going to be. This is obviously 2004. This was, during the time period that you had these kind of teen comedy movies, American Pie, Mean Girls, those kind of movies were out around the same time. I think Mean Girls was even the same year as this. And so my initial impression of it, just from watching the trailer, was very much based around that. And to be honest, watching the movie, it pretty much was that. It never really went, I think, in the same direction as something like American Pie. Like, it never really delved into like the same thing you'd see in like a lot of those, where I feel like they almost felt like they needed to go to the rated R territory in those kind of movies, where this one, it only got to the PG-13 and never really crossed it.
Are you thinking they could have made a version of this where there was a gratuitous nudity?
Well, at the very least, it could have potentially delved a little bit deeper into, I guess, the riskier and darker part of being in high school, regardless of if it's a Christian school or not. Or maybe because it's a Christian school, they could have delved into that. I think that they very much could have taken it in a direction. It's weird because watching it, I almost felt like the movie was a little bit too safe in a way. Safer than I thought it would be. I thought it was going to either lean very heavily into Christianity because of the subject matter, or it was going to go the complete opposite direction and just go, batshit crazy with, drugs, sex, rock and roll, like all that kind of stuff, just because I just know growing up as a kid, you would think in those kind of environments, they would be, the pure, clean groups. But from my experience, they tended to be some of the crazier bunch in that age group or whatever, where you would see those kind of crazy things happen. So I was actually kind of surprised that the only character that really, went that way was, oh man, I can't remember what her name is. Cassandra, the Jewish student. Like, I kind of feel like they kind of used her character to kind of have some of those more extreme examples, and in a way Macaulay Culkin, but I feel like that didn't really happen until he was just sarcastic until meeting her. And even then it never really got too crazy. It was interesting watching the movie, seeing it from that perspective, and having expectations and kind of it not meeting those expectations, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it definitely wasn't what I thought it was going to be going into it.
I could see it definitely being of a different time, because I feel like what you're describing is almost like Euphoria or something. Let's get an HBO version of this thing where you go down the rabbit hole of people really mixing in like who they are, during the day, especially at a private school or something like that, and what really goes on behind closed doors. I think it's very timid in the way it presents those items. I'm glad you mentioned Macaulay Culkin's character Roland in terms of, representing this person who is a part of the entire system, but because of his role, because of essentially them looking at him having an ailment, he just kind of goes along with the flow, even though he doesn't necessarily buy into the entire system that he's a part of. He needed that character, what Cassandra, to kind of get him to break away from the things that he was comfortable with. I actually liked him for being that character.
One of the interesting things is from him being that character, it didn't seem like he had anybody to relate to until that Cassandra came along. Like, he was basically, like you mentioned, just like the puppet, where he was like, okay, I want people to feel sorry for me by being with him. The case of like Mandy Moore's character, but I really liked how that Cassandra character came along. It really mixed everything up a lot and pushed the development forward for a lot of the other characters. And to me, like, I thought surprising ways. Like, I kind of maybe thought that Jenna Malone's character was gonna fall in line and just kind of do what she was supposed to do. And I thought it was interesting. Mary was her character's name. That, of course,
Of
right?
course.
I thought it was interesting how she went a different way than I was expecting.
Now, I know as we watched it, I think Matt, you were doing a lot of prediction, because even though you hadn't seen this, you were nailing every beat and point that was coming. I mean, what about it kind of gave itself away to you like that?
Well, it's funny because, like I said, I had only seen the trailer, and I think I had rewatched the trailer before we started watching it just to kind of remind myself of what it was. And yeah, I had called the boyfriend being gay. I don't know if it's because it was necessarily being telegraphed within the movie itself. I think it was just like, what's the most opposite situation that should happen in a movie like this, right? And I was like, I guarantee you that if he has a secret, it's he's gay, right?
It's a main comedy thing, right? Or something to just kind of be that extreme opposite of what's happening in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it would be the worst case scenario for somebody like her, right? I do think it was weird, and it actually played out through the entire movie that I thought it was kind of strange. Is when I watched the trailer back when I was younger, I was under the impression that Mandy Moore was the main character of this movie. Maybe it's just because she was the most recognizable to me at the time. Obviously, Jenna Malone, now I know who she is because I've seen her in lots of stuff since then. But at the time, I didn't really know who she was. I knew who Macaulay Culkin was, obviously is from the Home Alone franchise and Richie Rich and all that. But I thought Mandy Moore was the main character, and to find out that she was actually the antagonist in this, watching the trailer again, I was like, okay, I can see where the scenes kind of were pulled from, that she was the antagonist. But yeah, I think as a result of the way they kind of did the setup, I think a lot of it was kind of easy to predict. I think that there was very formulaic situations created. in it. I think it very much is influenced by the environment of it being a Christian school, but if you remove that, it's not too different than an American Pie or those kind of things that are in a similar vein, right? Like it's very much that coming of age teen, comedy where it's always like the most awkward situation possible is what's going to happen. And so it made it a lot easier to kind of see what was around the corner.
Yeah, I think you just nailed it because you're right. Within the context of it being this particular Christian environment, um, being able to identify that they're gonna just pull all the strings to tell their coming of age story. Yeah, I think that's spot on. Bobby, you were about to comment.
Another thing, obviously, with the Christian story is nobody cares if a kid gets pregnant, and like many other environments, right? But in a Christian environment, it's kind of like the Scarlet Letter, where it's like, oh, look at this person, And so it's a very interesting situation for a person to have like a physical tale of what they've done. And so it was interesting because, like, okay, she's got, I don't know, however many, like 4 months or whatever before she starts showing, and then it's all over for her, right? So there's a kind of ticking time bomb kind of thematic story aspect to a pregnancy in general.
Looking at the movie, and I think we could get into some of the stuff that we kind of look at as we watch these types of films. But there's a lot of points. I think the nostalgia part you mentioned, Matt, coming into just watching a movie from 2004, there was like an old internet search that was happening, and I kind of got giddy because I was like, oh, remember the internet before today, before it was all the trouble and pain that it brings us. And then looking at, what was it, the opening track Mandy Moore was singing? Do you think that was part of her contract to make sure that her music was featured in the film?
For sure.
Yeah, I think that's a requirement for getting Mandy Moore, right?
But we look at, I guess, what they were setting up, and there were so many like lines that kind of again poked fun. And I think I want to ask you how you felt about the idea, because we know this movie had mixed feelings in terms of the way it does poke fun and the hypocrisy of it. There were points where we have Mandy Moore's character saying, why else had Jesus directed me to a gun range? That type of stuff going on, where you have these people who really feel like they're being guided, by these ideologies, by, some spiritual force to do the things the way they do. And the movie does tear into them a bit because of the way they're living their lives. How did you feel about, I guess I'd call it the extreme nature of it. Bobby, what do you think?
It was kind of laughable, but also funny because it's true kind of thing. I mean, there's all sorts of, like a spectrum of when you say like the Christian label, to steal your line there. There's a big range in there. And I mean, it was really interesting how like a lot of that, and like I mean, I think the gun thing was kind of a bit cringy, right? And especially like in the time was, like all these school shootings and stuff. And I mean, some of these other lines, and like just the pastor was interesting too, how he was like overtly trying to be cool with the like, are you down with God? And like using all these like song lyrics to get his message across. And
But that's
it's just,
that's pretty close to like the kind of stuff you would see, especially
oh
during
yeah,
that time
for
period
sure,
where,
yeah.
here we are in, 2022, and I still think there's probably still Christian PSA commercials and clips that are very much in line with that. I mean, that's, trying to be cool to the younger crowd or whatever. I'm pretty sure there's someone doing shuffling, I'm shuffling to God, or I'm doing dabs for God or something like that, is I'm sure somewhere in a commercial or in a some sort of like group gathering or something like that with them. So
I'm both afraid of it, but I think we should look that up when we're done.
Oh
But
no!
I mean,
Oh no!
the question for you guys: does that kind of thing make it feel more relatable and make you want to engage more, or does it make you like want to put your head in your hands and think like, okay, they're trying too hard and this is kind of cringy?
Me personally, and this, I think we all have different experiences coming into this. I think that it's probably more spot on than anything else. And because of that, it's cringy. Because I have seen, And I have heard people who talk like this and act like this. And I have seen, I mean, I never went to any sort of religious school or whatever, so I can't really speak for how the school environment itself was. But for the most part, I feel like that's fairly universal in most of the stuff they did in this movie. I feel like they never actually went far enough into, at least from my perspective, it never really went that deep into the religious school aspect of it. It just seemed like a regular school with just that barrier knocked down where they can have banners and, signs and giant white Jesuses out on the lawn and stuff like that. Right. So I think that it was fine for the most part. I think that I can see how you can easily get, I mean, just focusing on a particular group, of, I don't even know what you would call it, like Eastern Christians or whatever, that you could get equally opposite responses from them, where you can get those who saw the movie and were completely offended by it, and those who saw it and like, oh, I know somebody who sounds like that or says stuff like that. So I feel like that actually makes it probably more effective, and it kind of shows that the directors and writers probably came from that environment, so that they weren't just pulling it out their ass, right? Like they actually had some connection to it in order to be able to, put it on screen the way that they did.
Bobby, is there anything that stood out to you the most?
What was interesting to me was the storytelling, like editing aspect of it, where basically, like, I feel like this was a much longer movie that got edited down, and particularly maybe even the very last scene. I wonder if that wasn't originally supposed to be the very last scene. Like maybe there was another scene with the pastor and the mom. Maybe, I mean, I don't know if there was enough, if there was enough
really
story there.
Quick and abrupt, because you go through all this lead up to this big prom night, to the kids who shouldn't be there breaking in, to shenanigans happening. Then it's like, okay, let's wrap everything up into a bow. Let's go. You have a baby, everyone's happy, and maybe there's some weird tension between Mary Louise Parker and the pastor, that is, you're right, unresolved. They don't really get into that.
But I did like the fact that happy ending wrapping up like resolution to their conflict a little bit. And I like the fact that the mother was there for her daughter, despite the fact that she got pregnant out of wedlock, and that's a problem for her. And I'm glad that she didn't have to worry about sending her to the boarding school. So I liked that kind of happy ending part of it, but it just feels to me like throughout the movie that this could have been a much longer movie, and that there was edits. And particularly what gives it away for me at the very, very end is their nice little like voiceover wrap up where she says, well, everything worked out great, basically, like kind of thing.
That's because they knew they weren't going to make a part 2, right?
Well, they can make a Netflix TV series, right?
Okay, there's the question. Matt, are they making a Netflix TV series? Is someone willing to jump out and make a something like this today?
Not Netflix. I very much can see a CW version of this. Much darker. Probably by season 3, they will have supernatural powers.
One of them is going to be a murderer.
Well, of course, there has to be. There has to be a murder mystery somewhere in there.
I do want to watch that show. I guess I could ask, and Matt, maybe you could speak to this part in terms of like the relationships that they built. Bobby, you mentioned this. We had adults who were overseeing these teens who were very disconnected from the lives that they were leaving, so much so that someone like Mary, the character Mary, can have a baby and hide it for so long. And I think that ties into the idea of, again, being in this bubble that they've created using a private school for something like that. But Matt, are there any other relationships that you found actually worked well, or some that you just thought they could have done without?
Well, I mean, the one thing that I kind of noticed going into this and watching it throughout was the fact that I didn't really feel like it. So just for example, if I compared this to Mean Girls or Juno came out about 3 years after this, and it has a somewhat similar concept based around like an unexpected teen pregnancy, caused by a guy with a lot of curly hair. And,
Figure skater.
I don't know if Michael Cera was a figure skater in Juno, but he did look like he was a mean speed runner. Yeah, it's strange because Mary didn't really come off as much of a main character in this as I think Juno did in her movie. And I cannot remember the main character's name in Mean Girls, but it, in a weird way, this movie became kind of an ensemble movie. Just the fact they even focused on the relationship between the Mary's mom and what was the name? Skip? Was that his name? Pastor Skip.
That's a good point. Yeah, I was gonna say the same thing.
You basically you got Mary and her relationship with in a way her, I can't remember what his name was, the gay boyfriend, Brian or something, Dean something.
All those names were
all those names.
I think it was Dean.
Yeah. But that didn't last very long, and they just kind of threw him out of the story until the very end. So you kind of had, Mary and Skip's son, Patrick, if I remember correctly.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then you had Mary's mom and Skip, and then you had Macaulay Culkin's Roland and Cassandra. And so it was almost like those, multi-cast Valentine's Day movies based off of holidays. Like you had all these different relationships or whatever. And so in a way, you did get kind of different areas. And in that sense, I feel like Jenna Malone's Mary kind of got the attention pulled away from her a little bit. And I feel like the situation between Roland and Cassandra probably was the most interesting to me. I kind of felt like the Skip and Mary's mom wasn't really necessary, to be honest. And I think it's mostly because it wasn't paid off. I don't think that a lot of these things really paid off the way they should have. I feel like, and again, kind of playing into what Bobby said, which was the aspect that I feel like there's probably either a different script that this started off as, or there's a bunch of footage left on the cutting room floor where I'm like, the pregnancy didn't really, it became an initial problem at the beginning, and then they just kind of ignored it until she was showing. Like much later on. She was practically about to give birth by the time it became a thing, and then it was only kind of a thing. It wasn't really like you're expelled now. Like they still let her, show up to prom and everything else. So it didn't become like a drama point. But because of that, I feel like anything they could have done with Mary was kind of taken away. I know she had a relationship with Dean, but it didn't really go as far as I think it could have. That's just, I feel like the attention on Roland and Cassandra probably had more feel to me, but in a way, because it was split, I kind of wish they would have done a little bit more with them. Like if they would have been the main characters, I would have been fine with it. Probably because they were the more interesting characters, and probably because they didn't give Jenna Malone's Mary as much drama related around the pregnancy. And so like she didn't have as much to bounce off of outside of the being ostracized by crap. I can't remember what they were called. Mandy Moore's group.
I know what you're talking about.
They had a name.
I don't remember the name right now as well.
No. So yeah, there wasn't nearly as much drama except for it got to a certain point, when they were going to pull her into the van and exercise her, right?
That was a fantastic scene.
There was just, I feel like there was a better script in here somewhere that they could have spent a little bit more time. They could have given me 15 more minutes and kind of delved a little bit more into some of those relationships. And I think it would have been a better movie for it.
Yeah, I mean, part of me wants to see a little bit of like what happened after, although it is implied. But I mean, given all that, it's not a super long movie, and there was a ton jam packed into it. I mean, this movie said a lot.
Yeah, but as Matt noted here, it is interesting to think about what they could have done if they gave you a little bit more, especially around Jenna Malone's character being the person that we were supposed to be focused on. But then we get sprinkles of everyone else and telling the tale and thinking about the pastor in particular, really just being set up to show, he can break as well or be beyond his moral compass in some sense, but really just still another person living his life.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's why they had that in there, is to show you that it's not just the kids who are struggling. It's everybody struggles with these kinds of things, with, the problems of life.
But it's so short. You see him both being pious, and then you see just a moment of him breaking And then you get the scene at the end where you have to just interpret that he's conflicted going into this, scene with this woman that he clearly is fond of, bringing her flowers, but doesn't necessarily know if he wants to go in because
See,
there's a kid having a baby who he told isn't allowed to go to school.
right, and then being at in a delivery room is such an odd place to do anything with flowers. I mean, I hope the flowers are going to be for the mother and not for this
The
other
mom.
girl that
Yeah.
he's going to try to hit on in front of her daughter that just had a baby. That was just weird to me, and it seemed like they just had to crunch two scenes together into one. And then another thing for me was it was a little bit unclear to me what Mary Louise Parker, like Mary's mom, what she was thinking during this. Like, was she
Mhm.
like, "Oh, great, he's here. Like, I really want to make it up with him," or was she just like, "Look, like, I have to put my focus on my daughter right now instead of and my brand new granddaughter instead of
Mhm.
like this other dude who's trying to give me flowers at my granddaughter's birth."
And I
Like,
think that's the key part. I think we just maybe if we got a little bit more from them, we could care about their plight in the middle of all this. But then this all took away from the story of Mary.
it really
So
needed to be two separate scenes in my mind.
mhm.
I didn't like the fact that there was, I mean, a birthing room is not the place to have any of these conversations unless it's to specifically say like, "Hey, I'm sorry for the way I acted to you. It wasn't
I
very
haven't been
nice."
in many birthing rooms, so I'll let you speak to us on that part
Yeah.
there, Bobby.
It's an extremely difficult time for the mother, as you can imagine. She
Mhm.
doesn't want randomers showing up in the room.
To be fair, he is the father of her boyfriend, so it's not like he's unrelated. And and he wants to date her mom. That's going to be an interesting
Look,
Thanksgiving.
here's what we have. We have a movie about religion and comedy and teenage angst and shenanigans with a whole bunch of people. Matt, should people watch this film?
Wow, that is so tough. Uh, if my choices are yes or no, I would probably say no. Not because it's a bad movie. I think that it's a perfectly acceptable movie. I think that if you came from this time period, if you were a high schooler, a teenager in the early 2000s, I think that there's going to be a lot of stuff you can relate to. But I think that the better movie that probably could have been wasn't there enough to have somebody who doesn't fall into it. If you were a teenager in the 90s or a teenager in the God help me, the 2010s or higher, you might not be able to relate to nearly as much in this as I think that like our age group probably can.
Mm-hmm. Bobby?
This movie was an hour and 32 minutes long, which gets a lot of extra points for me. It jammed a whole lot into an hour and 32 minutes. I think that other movies that are like 3.5 hours don't tell you as much story as this movie did. So if you have an hour and a half to spare and you don't want to start a whole series, then there you go.
I love that the time length is what you're all about. For me, like I opened up with, if you have some experience with religion in your youth, it's an interesting take on the way people look at things and the way they approach things. For that reason, I think it's worth watching. If you don't have that experience, I think it definitely falls under the lines of the other teenage movies that were out during this time, and you'd probably have more fun watching those other ones as a result of that. So I'm just gonna be in the middle here. Take a chance on it if you're feeling scrappy. I don't even know if it's streaming anywhere, so you might actually have to work for this one, which is probably gonna stop you from watching it. But still, if you see it, take a chance. You might enjoy it. So as always, thank you for listening and ask yourself, why would God make us so different if he wanted us to be the same?